The tray in Alina Hartley's hands trembled as the door to the grand hall swung open, and the first thing she saw was her own sister's face, twisted with satisfaction, watching her walk in wearing a black apron instead of a bridesmaid's gown. Just an hour earlier, Alina had been standing in the small staff room behind the estate's kitchen, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror, trying to convince herself that this was not really happening. She smoothed down the plain white shirt she had been handed, tucked a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear, and told herself that she could survive one evening. She had survived worse. She had survived her mother's sharp words at every family dinner, her sister's casual cruelty disguised as jokes, and years of being the daughter nobody bothered to introduce first. Surely, she could survive being handed a serving tray at Claudia's wedding. But survival and dignity were two very different things, and as Alina picked up the tray of champagne glasses and pushed open the door into the hall, she felt the difference settle over her like a cold hand on the back of her neck. The hall was breathtaking. Chandeliers dripped light onto white orchids that lined every table, and the guests moved through the space in gowns that cost more than Alina's monthly salary. She recognized cousins, aunts, family friends, people who had known her since she was a child, and not one of them looked twice at her. To them, she was simply part of the furniture now, a uniform instead of a person. It had started 3 days earlier, when her mother, Vivian Hartley, called her into the study with the tone she always used when she wanted something, and had already decided Alina had no say in it. "The wedding planner is short 2 servers," Vivian had said, not looking up from the seating chart spread across her desk. "Claudia needs everything to be perfect. You'll help." Alina had blinked, certain she misheard. "Help? You mean like work the wedding?" "You're good with people, you're organized. It's one evening, Alina. Surely you can do this for your sister." "I'm supposed to be a guest. I'm her sister." Vivian had finally looked up, and there was no warmth in her eyes, only the practiced patience of someone who had long ago decided which daughter mattered more. "You're also unemployed at the moment, dear. It wouldn't hurt to be useful for once." The words had landed like a slap, quiet but precise, the kind of cruelty her mother had perfected over the years. Alina had opened her mouth to argue, to remind her mother that she had lost her job in a round of layoffs that had nothing to do with her performance, that she had been sending out applications every single day, that she deserved better than being treated like hired help at her own sister's wedding. But she had learned long ago that arguing with Vivian was like arguing with a locked door. It never opened, no matter how hard you pushed. So here she was, tray in hand, weaving through a crowd of people who used to know her name. "Champagne?" she asked a cluster of women near the entrance, keeping her voice steady, her chin lifted just enough to hold on to whatever pride she had left. One of the women, a distant cousin named Charlotte, squinted at her for a moment before her eyes widened in recognition. "Alina, is that you?" "I didn't even." She stopped herself, glancing down at the apron, and an awkward silence stretched between them before Charlotte simply took a glass and turned back to her conversation, as though acknowledging the situation any further would be too uncomfortable for everyone involved. Alina moved on. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that pride was a luxury she could set aside for one night, that tomorrow this would all be a strange memory, a story she might tell someday about the worst night of her life turning into nothing more than an inconvenience. But then she saw Claudia. Her sister stood near the center of the hall in a wedding gown that seemed to glow under the chandelier light, laughing at something her fiancé, Gregory Sinclair, had said. Claudia had always been the version of the family that photographed well, that spoke well, that charmed every room she entered without effort. Alina had spent her whole life standing slightly behind her, not out of choice, but because that was where their mother had always placed her. Claudia's eyes drifted across the room and landed on Alina. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not quite guilt, not quite triumph, but a strange mixture of both. Then she smiled, the same practiced smile she gave photographers, and gestured Alina over with 2 fingers. "Alina, darling, could you get me a glass of water? Not champagne, I don't want to look flushed in photos." Claudia said it loudly enough for the small circle of guests around her to hear, and a few of them chuckled, not unkindly, but in the easy way people laugh when they assume everyone is in on the joke. Elena felt her face grow warm. "Of course," she said, and turned before anyone could see how much the words had cost her. As she walked toward the kitchen, she passed a table where an older woman, one of Vivian's oldest friends, was speaking to her husband. "I heard the younger one couldn't hold a job," the woman murmured, not quite quietly enough. "Such a shame. Claudia turned out so well." Elena kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her eyes forward. She had become very good at pretending words did not land, even when they struck exactly where they were meant to. In the kitchen, she found a moment of quiet among the chaos of caterers rushing between ovens and trays. A young man near the drink station glanced up at her, noticing the tightness in her jaw. "Rough crowd?" he asked, his tone light but not unkind. He wore the same uniform as her, a name tag that read Oliver pinned to his chest. "Something like that," Elena said, managing a small, tired smile. "For what it's worth," Oliver said, filling a glass with water and ice. "The people who treat servers badly are usually the ones who have never had to be one. Doesn't make it hurt less, I know. But it says more about them than it does about you." Elena looked at him properly for the first time, surprised by the simple honesty of it. It was such a small thing, a stranger's kindness in the middle of a night designed to make her feel small, but it steadied something in her chest. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She carried the water back out into the hall, weaving past guests who did not see her, past tables set with more silverware than she had ever owned, past the string quartet playing something soft and elegant in the corner. She delivered the glass to Claudia, who took it without a word of thanks, already turning back to her conversation, and Elena stood there for half a second longer than necessary, waiting for some acknowledgement that never came. It was in that half a second, standing at the edge of her sister's perfect wedding, invisible in a room full of people who had once called her family, that Elena noticed him for the first time. He stood near one of the tall windows at the far end of the hall, apart from the crowd in a way that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of tailoring rather than luck, and he was watching the room the way someone watches a play they are not particularly enjoying, patient but distant. There was something in his stillness that stood out among all the movement and noise, something that made Elena's eyes linger a moment longer than they should have. She did not know yet that he was a duke. She did not know his name, or that within a few hours he would notice her in a way no one else at that wedding had bothered to. All she knew, in that fleeting glance across a crowded room, was that, for the first time all evening, someone's eyes were not looking through her. Then Claudia's voice cut across the hall, sharp and impatient. "Elena, the guests at table 6 need their drinks refreshed. Chop, chop." Elena tore her gaze away from the stranger by the window and turned back toward the kitchen, tray in hand, telling herself that whoever he was, it did not matter. She was here to work, to survive the evening, to get through the humiliation without breaking. She had no room in her heart that night for curiosity about a stranger's stare. But as she walked away, she felt it again, the sensation of being watched, not with the dismissive indifference of the other guests, but with something closer to genuine attention. She glanced back once, just once, and found that the man by the window was still looking at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that the rest of the room had not even noticed was there. She did not know it yet, but the night was only just beginning, and nothing about it would go the way her mother or her sister had planned. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to lean against the cool wall and breathe. The noise of the party was muffled here, replaced by the clatter of pans and the low hum of caterers moving in practiced rhythm. She closed her eyes and told herself that she only had a few more hours to endure. A few more hours of trays and forced smiles and pretending that being invisible did not hurt. She thought about leaving. The idea crossed her mind more than once, a quiet voice suggesting she could simply walk out the back door, call a taxi, and let her mother deal with the consequences of being one server short. but she knew she would not do it. Not because she owed her mother or her sister anything more, but because walking away would prove something to herself that she was not ready to accept, that she had no fight left in her, that she could be pushed into a corner and simply disappear without protest. So she straightened her shoulders, picked up another tray, and pushed back through the doors into the glittering hall, unaware that the night was about to turn into something none of them had expected, least of all her. The band shifted into a slower song, and couples began to gather near the center of the floor. Alina moved along the edges of the room, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, murmuring polite responses to guests who barely acknowledged her presence. She passed close to the window where the stranger had been standing, but he was gone now, swallowed somewhere into the crowd, and she told herself it was for the best. It was near the dessert course, as the sun outside had fully given way to a deep blue evening, that Alina felt the first real crack in her composure. She was carrying a tray of delicate glasses filled with something sweet and pale gold when a young cousin, no older than 12, ran past her chasing another child, and their shoulders collided. The tray tipped. Alina managed to catch most of it, her hands moving fast, years of careful balance kicking in from summers spent waitressing during university. But 2 glasses slipped free and shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and sudden in the elegant hall. Conversation near her paused. Heads turned. And in that terrible, suspended second, Alina felt every eye in the vicinity land on her, not with concern, but with the particular judgment reserved for someone who has just confirmed everyone's low expectations of her. Careless, someone muttered, just loud enough to carry. Alina knelt quickly, gathering the broken glass with trembling fingers, her cheeks burning, her throat tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the shards on the floor and everything to do with the years of small humiliations that had led her to this exact moment. She was not thinking about the wedding anymore, or her sister, or her mother's cold instructions. She was thinking about how tired she was of being the one who apologized, the one who absorbed blame that was never entirely hers, the one who shrank herself to fit into whatever small space her family allowed her. A pair of polished black shoes stopped beside her on the floor. "Let me help you with that," a low, even voice said above her, and Alina looked up to find the stranger from the window kneeling down beside her, sleeves of his dark jacket brushing the marble as he began gathering the larger pieces of glass with careful, unhurried hands, as though there was nothing unusual at all about a guest of his evident standing kneeling on the floor to help a server clean up a mess that was not his to clean. "You don't have to do this," Alina whispered, glancing up at him, mortified that anyone, let alone someone who so clearly belonged among the wedding's most important guests, was kneeling beside her on the cold marble floor. "I can manage." "I know you can," he said simply, placing a jagged piece of glass onto her tray with the same steady calm he might use to discuss the weather. "That doesn't mean you should have to manage it alone." There was nothing dramatic in the way he said it, no attempt at charm, no performance for the small audience that had gathered to watch the spectacle of a broken tray. He simply spoke as though the idea of helping her was the most natural thing in the world, and somehow that quiet ordinariness struck Alina harder than any grand gesture could have. A waiter rushed over with a small broom, and the stranger rose to his feet in one smooth motion, extending a hand to help Alina up as well. She hesitated only a second before accepting it, and his grip was firm, steady, entirely unlike the careless brush of fingers she had grown used to receiving from people who barely registered her existence. "Thank you," she said quietly, brushing off her apron, aware of the eyes still lingering on them from nearby tables. "There's nothing to thank me for," he replied. "Accidents happen at every wedding. This one simply happened to involve glass instead of an argument over seating charts, which I understand is far more common." A faint, dry humor colored his words, and despite everything, Alina felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "You seem to know a lot about weddings," she said before she could stop herself. "I know a great deal about tedious social obligations," he said. "Weddings are simply the most elaborate version of them." She should have walked away then. She had a tray to refill, dishes to clear, A sister who would be furious if she noticed her sister lingering in conversation with one of the guests instead of working. But something about him made her linger a moment longer than she should have. "I don't think I caught your name," she said. "Nathaniel," he said, and something in the way he said it, simply, without any title attached, told her that whoever he was used to people already knowing far more about him than his first name suggested. "And you are?" "Alina," she said. "I'd shake your hand properly, but I think I still have glass on my fingers." He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him all evening, and it transformed his face from something composed and distant into something far warmer. "Another time, perhaps." Before she could respond, Claudia's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. "Alina, what is taking so long? We have guests waiting." Alina's stomach dropped. She turned to see her sister approaching, her expression sharpening the moment she registered exactly who Alina had been speaking with. Claudia's eyes flicked from Alina to Nathaniel and back again, calculation replacing irritation almost instantly, the way it always did whenever Claudia sensed an opportunity worth adjusting her behavior for. "Your Grace," Claudia said, her voice shifting into a honeyed warmth Alina had heard her use countless times with people she wanted to impress. "I hope my sister hasn't been bothering you. She's helping out this evening. Staffing shortage, you understand." Alina felt the words like a physical blow. "Your Grace." The title landed in her mind with sudden, dizzying clarity, and she understood now why the entire room had seemed to orbit around him without him ever needing to move. He was not simply a guest. He was the guest, the one whose presence had likely determined half the seating arrangement, the one whose family name probably carried more weight than every other name in that hall combined. "She wasn't bothering me at all," Nathaniel said evenly, his tone carrying just enough coolness to make Claudia's smile falter slightly. "In fact, she handled a small accident with far more grace than most people manage at weddings, staff or otherwise." Claudia's laugh came out a beat too late, a beat too high. "Well, that's Alina for you, always so capable." The compliment sounded like an apology dressed up as praise, and Alina recognized it instantly for what it was, a way for Claudia to smooth over the awkwardness without ever acknowledging what had actually happened, without ever admitting that her own sister had been reduced to serving drinks at her wedding, while she floated through the evening in silk and pearls. "If you'll excuse me," Alina said quickly, desperate to escape the tension crackling between her sister and the man who now had a title attached to his quiet kindness. "I should get back to work." She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked briskly toward the kitchen, tray balanced carefully in her hands, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the broken glass, and everything to do with the strange warmth still lingering in her chest from the way he had looked at her, as though she were simply a person and not a uniform. Behind her, she heard Claudia's voice drop into something sharper, quieter, meant only for Nathaniel's ears, though a passing waiter later told Oliver, who told Alina much later that night, that Claudia had spent the next several minutes trying to steer the Duke's attention toward the other bridesmaids, toward anyone who fit more neatly into the story she wanted her wedding to tell. In the kitchen, Alina set down her tray and pressed both hands flat against the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Oliver glanced over from where he was arranging a tray of desserts and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Worse," Alina muttered. "I think I just had a conversation with a duke while covered in broken glass." Oliver let out a low whistle. "The Duke of Ravensworth. He's been the talk of the kitchen all night. Half the catering staff has a theory about why he's even here. Word is he's usually impossible to get to attend anything social." Alina frowned. "Why would he come to my sister's wedding then?" "Family obligation, probably. I heard his mother is close with the groom's family." Oliver shrugged, sliding a tray toward her. "Either way, you should probably head back out before your sister sends a search party." Alina nodded, gathering herself, forcing the strange fluttering in her chest back down into something manageable. She had no business thinking about a duke, no matter how kind his eyes had been or how steady his hands were when he knelt to help her. She was staffed tonight, and by tomorrow she would return to being simply the overlooked younger sister, and whatever brief moment of connection had passed between them in that hall would fade into nothing more than a strange story to tell no one. But as she walked back into the main room, Trey balanced once more, she could not stop herself from glancing toward the window where he had been standing earlier. He was seated now, at the head table with the other important guests, engaged in polite conversation with an older woman Alina did not recognize. He did not look up as she passed, and she told herself that was for the best, that whatever had happened between them was simply a small kindness offered in a moment of embarrassment, nothing more. The evening wore on. Alina refilled glasses, cleared plates, weathered another dozen small humiliations from guests who treated her as though she were part of the room's decor rather than a person with feelings. Her feet ached inside shoes that were not made for hours of standing, and her back throbbed from bending over tables all evening. But she kept moving, kept her expression neutral, kept reminding herself that this was temporary, that dawn would come and this night would end. It was during the speeches, as Gregory's best man stood to deliver a toast filled with inside jokes Alina did not understand, that she found herself standing near the edge of the room, tray empty, waiting for a lull in which she could slip back to the kitchen unnoticed. She allowed herself a moment to simply watch the celebration, the way the candlelight caught on Claudia's veil, the way her sister laughed at exactly the right moments, radiant and adored, everything Alina had never quite managed to be in their mother's eyes. She did not notice Nathaniel had risen from his seat until he was standing beside her. "You've been on your feet all night," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the applause following the toast. "Occupational hazard," Alina replied, trying to keep her tone light, though exhaustion had begun to seep into her words despite her best efforts. "Your family seems to have a rather unusual understanding of hospitality," he said, and there was something careful in the way he chose his words, an observation rather than an accusation, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. Alina glanced around quickly, checking that no one was close enough to overhear. "It's complicated," she said. "Family often is," he agreed. He studied her for a long moment, and Alina had the distinct sense that he was seeing far more than she intended to show, the tiredness behind her polite smile, the years of quiet hurt she had learned to carry without visible weight. "For what it's worth, you handled yourself with more dignity tonight than most people manage in far easier circumstances." Alina did not know how to respond to that. No one had said something like that to her in longer than she could remember, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. "Thank you," she managed finally. "That means more than you probably realize." Before he could respond, the crowd's attention shifted toward the dance floor as the newlyweds prepared for their first dance, and Nathaniel gave her a small nod before returning to his seat, leaving Alina standing at the edge of the room with her empty tray and a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest, one she was not entirely sure what to do with. She watched Claudia and Gregory move across the floor, perfectly synchronized, perfectly rehearsed, and for the first time all evening, Alina did not feel the familiar sting of comparison. Instead, she found herself thinking about steady hands helping her gather broken glass, about a voice that had called her handling of an accident graceful instead of careless, about eyes that had looked at her and seen a person rather than a uniform. She had no idea, as she stood there in the glow of the chandeliers, that this small, unexpected kindness was only the beginning, or that before the night ended, the Duke of Ravensworth would do something that would upend every careful assumption her family had made about where she belonged. A sharp tug on her sleeve pulled Alina away from her thoughts, before the first dance had even ended. She turned to find her mother standing there, her expression tight with a fury she was clearly struggling to keep hidden beneath the polished surface she showed to guests. "What exactly were you doing talking to the Duke?" Vivian hissed, her fingers digging into Alina's arm as she steered her toward the edge of the hall, away from listening ears. "He was helping me clean up broken glass," Alina said, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage despite the sting of her mother's grip. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." "You were drawing attention to yourself," Vivian snapped, Tonight is about your sister, not about you flirting with the most eligible guest in the room while wearing an apron." "I wasn't flirting," Alina said, heat rising in her cheeks. "He was being polite." "That's all." Vivian's eyes narrowed, scanning her daughter's face as though searching for a lie. "See that it stays that way. The last thing this family needs is gossip about you throwing yourself at a duke while working as a server at your own sister's wedding. Do you understand how that would look?" Alina felt something crack quietly inside her chest, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that she had to look away from her mother's face to keep the tears building behind her eyes from falling. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice flat. Vivian released her arm and smoothed down the front of her gown, already glancing back toward the dance floor where Claudia and Gregory were being joined by other couples. "Good. Now go check on table 12. They've been asking for more wine for the last 10 minutes. Alina watched her mother walk away without a backward glance. Already composing her expression back into the warm, gracious hostess she performed for everyone but her own children. She stood there for a long moment, tray forgotten at her side, feeling the familiar ache of being reminded, once again, exactly where she stood in her family's careful hierarchy. She made her way toward table 12, forcing her face into something pleasant, pouring wine for a group of Gregory's relatives who barely paused their conversation long enough to notice her presence. As she moved between tables, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach twist. Someone was discussing which of Claudia's bridesmaids seemed most likely to catch the Duke's attention before the night ended, listing names and qualities like items on an auction block, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely uncaring, that the woman refilling their wine glasses was the bride's own sister. By the time the dance floor filled with more guests and the band shifted into something livelier, Alina had retreated once more to the relative safety of the kitchen, her feet throbbing, her jaw sore from hours of holding a polite expression in place. Oliver handed her a glass of water without being asked, watching her carefully. "You look like you need a minute," he said. "I need several years, actually," Alina replied, managing a weak laugh despite the exhaustion pressing down on her. "Family trouble?" Oliver asked, leaning against the counter. Alina hesitated, unsure how much to share with someone she had only met a few hours earlier, but something about the kitchen's quiet chaos, the steam rising from trays of food, the absence of judgmental eyes, made her feel safe enough to speak honestly for the first time all evening. "My mother just accused me of flirting with a guest because he helped me clean up broken glass," she said. "Apparently working her daughter's wedding as unpaid staff wasn't humiliating enough. I also have to make sure I don't accidentally embarrass anyone by existing too visibly." Oliver winced sympathetically. "That's rough. For what it's worth, from what I saw, the Duke seemed pretty interested in talking to you, and not because you were pouring his champagne." Alina shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Whatever it was, it's not going anywhere. Men like him don't end up with women like me. Not really. Not outside of some story." "Maybe," Oliver said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Or maybe you're selling yourself short because you've spent your whole life being told you should." The words landed with unexpected weight, and Alina found herself staring at him, surprised by how easily a near stranger had identified something it had taken her years to even partially understand about herself. Before she could respond, one of the head caterers called Oliver's name, and he offered her an apologetic shrug before hurrying off to help plate the next course. Alina took a few more minutes in the quiet of the kitchen, gathering herself, before picking up a fresh tray and heading back out into the hall. The evening had shifted into its later hours now, the energy of the party settling into the comfortable warmth of good food and flowing wine, guests scattered across tables in easy conversation, the dance floor thinning as people rested their feet between songs. She noticed Nathaniel again near the head table, engaged in conversation with Gregory's father, his expression polite but distant, the same careful composure he had worn all evening except for the brief moments when his attention had turned to her. She told herself not to look too long, not to read too much into a few kind words exchanged over broken glass, but her eyes kept drifting back to him despite her best efforts. It was nearly an hour later, as dinner service wound down and the staff began preparing for the dessert course, that Alina found herself assigned to a particularly unpleasant task. Claudia, flushed with wine and the giddy exhaustion of her own wedding, pulled her aside near the kitchen entrance, her earlier spite sharpened by alcohol into something more careless. "I need you to go around and collect the empty champagne bottles," Claudia said, gesturing vaguely toward the tables. "The photographer wants clean shots for the last hour, and honestly, Alina, you're better at this sort of thing than the actual staff. You've had practice being useful without being seen." The words hit harder than Alina expected, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who did not even realize, or perhaps did not care, how deeply they cut. She had spent her whole life being useful without being seen, running errands, absorbing blame, smoothing over their mother's moods, and hearing it said aloud, so plainly, so carelessly, felt like being handed a mirror she had no interest in looking into. "Of course," Alina said quietly, because there was nothing else to say, no version of pushing back that would not result in another lecture from her mother about causing a scene. She moved from table to table, collecting empty bottles, keeping her eyes low, her movements efficient, trying to disappear into the task the way she had disappeared into so many others over the years. It was mindless work, and that was almost a mercy, giving her hands something to do while her mind wandered through the accumulated weight of the evening. She was reaching for a bottle near one of the far tables when she heard raised voices nearby, an argument breaking out between two of Gregory's cousins over something trivial, voices rising louder than the general hum of the party. She did not think much of it until one of the men, clearly having had too much to drink, stumbled backward and collided directly into her, sending the bottle in her hand crashing to the floor, along with a stack of dishes she had been balancing on her other arm. The sound was loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables, and Alina felt her face flush hot with humiliation as she dropped to her knees to gather the mess, aware of eyes turning toward her once again, aware of whispered comments she could not quite make out but could easily imagine. "Watch where you're going," the man who had bumped into her said, his words slurred, directed at her rather than at himself, as though the collision had been entirely her fault for standing in his way. "I'm sorry," Alina said automatically, the apology slipping out before she could stop it, years of conditioning kicking in even when logic told her she had done nothing wrong. "You should be more careful," the man continued, his voice carrying further than he probably intended, drawing more attention from the surrounding tables. "This is a wedding, not wherever you usually work." Alina felt heat rush to her cheeks, humiliation curdling into something closer to anger, but she said nothing, focusing instead on gathering the broken glass and scattered dishes as quickly as possible, wanting nothing more than to escape the growing circle of attention. It was then that a voice cut through the commotion, calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "I believe the collision was your doing, not hers." Alina looked up to find Nathaniel standing at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp with something that made the drunk man's bravado falter almost instantly. "Your Grace, I didn't mean," the man began, stumbling over his words as the reality of who he was addressing seemed to sober him slightly. "I saw the entire exchange," Nathaniel said evenly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She was standing still, collecting glassware as instructed. You walked into her while distracted by an argument that had nothing to do with her. I would suggest an apology, though I understand that may be a novel concept for you this evening." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small crowd, and the man's face flushed with embarrassment as he mumbled a hasty apology toward Alina before retreating, clearly eager to escape further scrutiny. The small gathering of onlookers began to disperse, their attention shifting elsewhere, the moment already fading into the background noise of the party. Nathaniel knelt down beside Alina once more, helping her gather the remaining pieces of broken glass, his movements unhurried despite the attention their proximity was drawing from nearby tables. "You don't have to keep rescuing me," Alina said quietly, though there was no real protest behind the words, only a tired sort of gratitude she did not quite know how to express. "I'm not rescuing you," Nathaniel said. "I'm simply pointing out facts that seem to be inconvenient for everyone else in this room to acknowledge. You've done nothing wrong tonight except exist in a space that apparently only knows how to treat you as an inconvenience." Alina's hands stilled for a moment over the shattered glass, his words settling into her chest with unexpected force. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of pity, any hint that his kindness was simply performance for an audience, but found only quiet sincerity. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could consider whether it was wise to ask it. "You don't know me. I'm just staff at a wedding you're probably obligated to attend." Nathaniel paused, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he seemed to bring to everything. "Perhaps because I've spent most of tonight watching a room full of people fail to notice something rather obvious," he said finally. "What's that?" Alina asked. "That the most graceful person here tonight isn't the bride," he said simply, and then rose to his feet, offering her his hand once more, leaving Alina kneeling on the floor with her heart pounding and her mind racing to catch up with words she was not entirely sure she had heard correctly. Alina did not have time to respond before Claudia appeared at her side, her earlier flush of wine now replaced by something colder, sharper, her eyes flicking between Alina and Nathaniel with open suspicion. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry about the mess," Claudia said quickly, her voice pitched into the same honeyed warmth she had used earlier, though there was a brittleness to it now that had not been there before. "My sister can be a bit clumsy. I hope it hasn't ruined your evening." "Your sister has done nothing but handle a difficult evening with remarkable composure," Nathaniel replied, his tone even but firm. "If anyone owes an apology, it's your cousin's guest, who was rude enough to blame her for his own carelessness." Claudia's smile faltered just slightly before snapping back into place. "Of course, I'll speak to him." She turned to Alina, her expression shifting into something Alina recognized instantly, the practiced sweetness that always preceded a private reprimand. "Alina, could you help me with something in the back for a moment?" It was not a request. Alina set down the tray of collected glass shards with a nearby staff member and followed her sister toward a quiet corridor just off the main hall, away from the noise and light of the party. The moment they were out of earshot, Claudia's expression hardened completely. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Claudia demanded, her arms crossed tightly over her gown. "I'm working like Mom told me to," Alina said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "You're making a scene," Claudia hissed. "Do you have any idea how it looks, having the Duke of Ravensworth kneeling on the floor with the caterer? People are talking, Alina. This is my wedding." "I didn't ask him to help me," Alina said. "I didn't ask for any of this. You're the one who decided I should be working here in the first place." "Because you needed something to do with yourself," Claudia snapped. "You've been unemployed for months, moping around Mom's house like you're waiting for someone to fix your life for you. This was supposed to be a favor." Alina felt something in her chest tighten painfully at the unfairness of the accusation, the years of quiet effort, the countless applications sent into silence, the interviews that led nowhere, all reduced by her sister to laziness and self-pity in the span of a single sentence. "A favor," Alina repeated, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it level. "Claudia, you had me serve drinks at your wedding in an apron while you danced in front of everyone we've ever known. How is that a favor to me?" Claudia's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered across her face that almost looked like guilt, quickly buried beneath practiced indifference. "It's not about you, Alina. It's never been about you. Tonight is about me, and I need you to stop drawing attention away from that. Stay in the kitchen for the rest of the night if you have to. Just stop talking to my guests." Before Alina could respond, their mother appeared at the end of the corridor, drawn by the tension radiating between her daughters even from a distance. "What's going on here?" Vivian asked, her sharp eyes moving between them. "Nothing," Claudia said quickly, smoothing down her gown. "I was just reminding Alina to focus on her duties." Vivian turned her gaze fully onto Alina, and the disappointment there was so familiar, so well worn, that Alina barely felt it land anymore, though the numbness that had replaced feeling was its own kind of wound. "I heard about the incident with the Duke," Vivian said. "Alina, I need you to understand something. Men like that do not marry women who serve them champagne. Whatever attention he's showing you tonight is simply politeness, or perhaps pity. Don't embarrass yourself or this family by mistaking it for anything more." "I never said I thought it was anything more," Alina said quietly, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth, a lie she told simply to end the conversation faster. "Good," Vivian said, satisfied. "Now go help with the dessert service. We're behind schedule." Alina walked away without another word, her hands curling into fists at her sides as she made her way back toward the kitchen. She had spent years absorbing her family's criticism, telling herself it came from love twisted by stress or old family patterns she did not fully understand. But standing in that corridor, hearing her mother dismiss even the possibility that someone might see genuine worth in her, something inside her finally, quietly, began to shift. In the kitchen, Oliver took one look at her face and did not ask questions, simply handing her a tray of dessert plates and letting her work in silence for a few minutes, the rhythm of the task offering a small, steady comfort. "You okay?" he finally asked, once the worst of her tension seemed to ease slightly. "I will be," Alina said, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she almost believed it. The dessert course brought a shift in the evening's structure. The head table was being rearranged slightly to accommodate a toast from the groom's grandmother, and several guests were being shuffled to different seats to make room for the elderly woman's wheelchair near the front. Alina, tray in hand, found herself standing near the edge of the reshuffling, watching as the wedding planner, a harried woman named Margaret, tried to sort out the sudden confusion. "We're one seat short at the Duke's table," Margaret said, mostly to herself, flipping through a stack of place cards with increasing frustration. "Lady Pemberton was supposed to sit there, but she's left early with a headache, and now we've got an empty chair right beside His Grace during the toasts. It'll look terrible in photographs." One of the other servers, a young woman Alina did not recognize, glanced around the room before her eyes landed on Alina. "Maybe just remove the chair. No one will notice." "The photographer specifically wants full table shots," Margaret said, rubbing her temples. "We need someone in that seat, or we need to explain an empty chair in every photograph taken for the next half hour." Alina, standing nearby with a tray of half-cleared plates, had no intention of involving herself in the wedding planner's crisis. She began to turn away, eager to retreat to the relative safety of the kitchen before her name could somehow become attached to the problem, when Margaret's eyes landed on her. "You," Margaret said, gesturing vaguely, "you're roughly the right size. Could you just sit there for a few minutes while we sort out the photographs? Just until we can pull another chair from storage, so it doesn't look so obviously empty." Alina froze, the request landing somewhere between absurd and mortifying. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said quickly. "I'm staff. I shouldn't be sitting at the head table." "It's just for the photographs," Margaret said, already moving on to another problem, her attention scattered across a dozen small crises at once. "No one will even notice. Just sit, smile if you have to, and get up the moment we've sorted the extra chair." Alina hesitated, glancing toward the head table where Nathaniel sat in quiet conversation with the elderly grandmother, unaware yet of the small crisis unfolding a few feet away. The idea of sitting there, even briefly, even under the guise of solving a logistical problem, felt impossibly dangerous, a step too far into territory her mother and sister had made abundantly clear did not belong to her. But before she could formulate a polite refusal, Margaret had already hurried off to handle another emergency, leaving Alina standing awkwardly near the empty chair, tray still in her hands, uncertain what to do next. She set the tray down carefully on a side table, deciding that the safest course of action was simply to walk away, to disappear back into the kitchen before anyone noticed the confusion surrounding the empty seat. She had taken only a few steps when she heard her name spoken, quiet but clear, cutting through the noise of the room in a way that made her stop instantly. "Elena." She turned to find Nathaniel watching her from his seat at the head table, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady on hers across the short distance between them. And in the space of that single, suspended moment, before he rose from his chair and reached for the empty seat beside him, Elena felt something shift in the air of the room, some quiet reordering of the evening's careful hierarchy that she did not yet fully understand but would remember for the rest of her life. Nathaniel rose from his seat, and for a moment the entire head table seemed to pause around him, conversations trailing off as guests noticed the shift in his attention. He walked the short distance to where Elena stood frozen near the side table, and without a word of explanation to anyone watching, he reached for the back of the empty chair beside his own seat and pulled it out, the legs scraping softly against the polished floor. "Please," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily in the sudden quiet that had settled around them, "join me." Elena's heart pounded so hard, she was certain everyone nearby could hear it. "I can't," she said quietly, glancing around at the guests who had begun to notice, at the wedding planner frozen mid-stride a few tables away, at the photographer who had lowered his camera in confusion. "I'm working. I'm not a guest." "You are tonight," Nathaniel said simply, still holding the chair, patient and unmoving, as though the entire room's growing attention meant nothing to him at all. "Elena," her mother's voice cut across the space, sharp with barely restrained panic, as Vivian appeared at the edge of the head table, her face pale beneath her careful makeup. "I'm sure His Grace doesn't mean to trouble you. She has work to attend to." "I'm not troubling her," Nathaniel said, his tone remaining even, though there was something firmer beneath it now, an authority that made even Vivian's practiced composure falter slightly. "I'm inviting her to sit. There's a difference." The hall had gone quieter now, guests at nearby tables turning to watch the unfolding scene, whispers beginning to ripple outward like water disturbed by a stone. Elena felt every eye in the room settle on her, and for a terrifying moment, the old instinct rose up in her, the years of training that told her to shrink, to apologize, to disappear back into the kitchen before she could embarrass anyone further. But then she caught sight of Claudia's face across the room, frozen in an expression of pure disbelief, and something in Elena's chest steadied instead of crumbling. She thought of every dismissed contribution, every eye that had passed over her all evening as though she were simply part of the room's furniture, every small cruelty disguised as concern for appearances. And she thought of the quiet, steady kindness of a man who had knelt beside her twice that night without asking anything in return, who had looked at her not as an inconvenience or an embarrassment, but as a person worth noticing. "Thank you," Elena said, and stepped forward, taking the seat Nathaniel had pulled out for her. He pushed the chair in gently as she settled into it, then returned to his own seat beside her, unhurried, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, as though a duke inviting a server to sit at the head table of a society wedding was the most natural occurrence in the world. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall, quiet at first, then growing as more guests turned to watch, their curiosity impossible to suppress. Elena kept her spine straight, her hands folded carefully in her lap, aware of her plain uniform in stark contrast to the elegant gowns surrounding her, aware of the whispers she could not quite make out but could easily imagine. "Elena, this really isn't appropriate," Vivian said, her voice tight, still hovering near the table, clearly caught between the desire to intervene and the awareness that further protest in front of so many guests would only draw more attention to the very thing she was trying to avoid. "I think it's perfectly appropriate," Nathaniel said, before Elena could respond. "Your daughter has spent the entire evening working tirelessly while being treated, by more than a few of your guests, with considerably less courtesy than she deserves. I see no reason she shouldn't be permitted a few minutes to sit." The words landed with quiet, devastating precision, and Elena watched her mother's face shift through several emotions in rapid succession, embarrassment, anger, and finally, a forced, brittle smile aimed at the small audience now openly watching their exchange. "Of course," Vivian said stiffly. "How thoughtful of you." She retreated a few steps but did not leave entirely, hovering at the edge of the head table like a storm cloud waiting to break. The elderly grandmother seated on Nathaniel's other side leaned forward slightly, studying Alina with sharp, curious eyes. "You're the bride's sister, I take it," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades commanding rooms without effort. "Yes, ma'am," Alina said, resisting the urge to fidget under the woman's assessing gaze. "And you've spent the evening serving drinks instead of celebrating with your family," the woman continued, her tone difficult to read, somewhere between observation and quiet judgment aimed not at Alina, but at the family who had placed her there. "It was a staffing shortage," Alina said carefully, unwilling to speak ill of her family in front of strangers no matter how deeply the evening had wounded her. The grandmother said, clearly not fooled by the diplomatic answer, though she did not press further, instead turning her attention to a nearby server for a fresh cup of tea, leaving Alina grateful for the reprieve. Nathaniel leaned slightly toward Alina, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the ambient noise of the hall slowly returning to its usual volume, as the initial shock of the moment faded into curious murmurs rather than open staring. "You handled that better than most people twice your age would have," he said. "I don't feel like I handled it well," Alina admitted quietly. "I feel like I just made everything worse." "You made things honest," Nathaniel corrected gently. "There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment." Alina allowed herself a small, tired smile, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly despite the dozens of eyes still occasionally flicking toward her from surrounding tables. "You have a habit of showing up exactly when things are falling apart," she said. "Perhaps," he said, something almost playful entering his tone for the first time all evening. "Or perhaps I simply have better timing than most people give me credit for." Across the room, Alina caught sight of Claudia making her way toward the head table with the fixed, brittle smile of someone about to perform damage control in front of an audience. Alina braced herself, aware that whatever calm she had managed to find in the last few minutes was about to be tested. "Alina, darling," Claudia said, her voice pitched for the benefit of nearby guests, sweet and performative in a way that made Alina's stomach twist. "I didn't realize you'd finished with your duties. Are you joining us for dessert then?" The question carried an edge beneath its polite surface, a warning wrapped in false warmth, and Alina understood exactly what her sister was really asking, whether Alina intended to make this moment last, whether she intended to embarrass the family further by accepting an invitation that had not come from anyone in Claudia's carefully controlled guest list. "His Grace was kind enough to offer me a seat," Alina said evenly, refusing to apologize for something that required no apology. Claudia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. How generous of him! She turned her attention fully to Nathaniel, her voice softening into something more overtly charming. "Your Grace, I hope my sister isn't distracting you from the celebration. I know how tedious these things can be for someone in your position, surrounded by people you barely know." "I've found the evening considerably more interesting than I expected," Nathaniel replied, his tone polite but pointed enough that Claudia's smile faltered again, just slightly before she recovered. "Well," Claudia said, clearly searching for a graceful exit from a conversation that was not unfolding the way she had hoped, "I should get back to my other guests. Alina, don't stay too long. There's still cleanup to manage before the night ends." The reminder was delivered with a saccharine smile, but the message beneath it was unmistakable, a subtle assertion of the hierarchy Claudia was determined to maintain even in front of a duke, even after everything that had already happened that evening. "I'll make sure she's not overburdened," Nathaniel said smoothly, and something in his tone made it clear the conversation was over, that whatever authority Claudia was accustomed to wielding within her family carried considerably less weight in this particular exchange. Claudia offered a tight nod and retreated back toward the dance floor, her posture stiff with barely contained frustration. And Alina watched her go with a strange mixture of guilt and quiet satisfaction that she did not entirely know how to reconcile. "You didn't have to do that," Alina said softly, once Claudia was out of earshot. "I know," Nathaniel said. "I wanted to." The dessert course continued around them, the string quartet shifting into something lighter and more celebratory as the evening moved toward its final hours. Alina found herself, for the first time all night, actually enjoying a conversation rather than simply enduring an interaction, talking with Nathaniel about small, ordinary things, the kind of easy conversation she had almost forgotten she was capable of having with someone who was not measuring her worth against her sisters or waiting for her to prove herself useful. She learned that he had inherited his title far younger than he had expected, after his father's unexpected passing, and that the weight of the responsibility had left him with little patience for the performative nature of events like this one, gatherings built more around appearances than genuine connection. She learned that he had attended tonight only because his mother had insisted on maintaining old family ties with Gregory's family, and that he had spent most of the evening counting down the hours until he could reasonably leave without causing offense. "And then you caused a scene helping a caterer clean up broken glass," Alina said, a genuine smile finally breaking through the exhaustion of the evening. "In my defense," Nathaniel said, "I've found the evening far less tedious since then." Alina laughed, a real laugh, the first one she had allowed herself all night, and the sound seemed to surprise even her, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to laugh freely without immediately calculating who might be watching or judging. It was in that moment, laughing quietly at the head table of her sister's wedding, seated in a chair that a duke had pulled out for her in front of an entire room of people who had spent the evening looking straight through her, that Alina realized something had shifted permanently. Whatever happened after tonight, whatever consequences waited for her once the last guests departed, and her family's careful performance dropped away, she would never again let herself believe she deserved to be invisible. But the night was not over yet, and the whispers spreading through the hall, the quiet calculations already forming behind a dozen curious eyes, were only the beginning of a reckoning that would follow Alina long after the last of the wedding guests went home. By the time the last of the wedding guests began filtering toward the exits, coats collected and farewells exchanged, the story of the sister who had been pulled from serving drinks to sitting beside the Duke of Ravensworth had already made its way through nearly every table in the hall. Alina felt it in the glances that lingered a beat too long, in the sudden interest of relatives who had ignored her completely just hours earlier, in the way conversations seemed to pause slightly whenever she passed, as though everyone were waiting to see what she might do next. She had returned to her duties after dessert, insisting despite Nathaniel's quiet suggestion that she had done enough for one evening, feeling that abandoning her responsibilities entirely would only give her mother and sister more ammunition for the confrontation she knew was coming. She moved through the final hour of the reception with a strange new steadiness, the earlier humiliation of the evening replaced by something quieter and more resilient, a sense that she had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, been seen exactly as she was and found worthy of respect rather than dismissal. Nathaniel found her once more near the coat check as the evening wound down, guests trickling out into the cool night air, the band packing up their instruments behind them. "I have to speak with the family before I leave," he said, his tone carrying a seriousness that had not been there during their earlier conversation. "I wanted to make sure you were all right first." "I'm fine," Alina said, though the words came out more uncertain than she intended. "You don't have to pretend with me," Nathaniel said gently. "Not after tonight." Alina managed a tired smile. "It's been a long night. I think I'll be feeling the full weight of it tomorrow, once the adrenaline wears off." "For what it's worth," Nathaniel said, "I don't regret a single moment of it. And I hope, whatever happens after tonight, that you don't either." Before Alina could respond, she caught sight of her mother approaching from across the emptying hall, and something in Vivian's expression told her the calm politeness maintained for the sake of the remaining guests was about to disappear entirely. Your Grace, Vivian said, her voice carrying the strained warmth of someone determined to salvage what remained of the evening's careful presentation. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence tonight. I hope you'll forgive any confusion regarding the seating. There was no confusion, Nathaniel said evenly. I invited Alina to sit with me because I wanted her company. I hope that isn't a problem. Vivian's smile tightened, the strain behind it becoming harder to disguise. Of course not. It's simply unusual given the circumstances. The circumstances being that she was working while everyone else celebrated, Nathaniel said, his tone remaining polite, but carrying an edge that made Vivian's composure falter noticeably. I confess I found that arrangement rather unusual myself. Vivian's eyes flicked toward Alina, something sharp and warning in her gaze, though she quickly composed herself, aware of the few remaining guests still lingering nearby. Family arrangements can be complicated, Your Grace. I'm sure you understand. I understand a great deal more than you might expect, Nathaniel said, and though his tone remained perfectly courteous, there was a quiet finality to the words that left Vivian without an easy response. He turned to Alina, his expression softening considerably. I hope we'll have the chance to speak again under better circumstances. I'd like that, Alina said quietly, and meant it more than she was entirely comfortable admitting to herself. Nathaniel offered a small, respectful nod to Vivian before making his way toward the exit, leaving mother and daughter standing in the thinning crowd of the hall, the tension between them thick enough to feel physically. The moment the doors closed behind the last departing guests, Vivian's carefully maintained composure shattered entirely. What were you thinking? She hissed, rounding on Alina the instant they were alone. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I sat in a chair, Alina said, her own patience, worn thin by hours of humiliation, finally beginning to fray. That's all that happened. He offered and I accepted. I didn't force anyone to do anything. You embarrassed this family in front of half the county, Vivian snapped. The Duke of Ravensworth pulling out a chair for the caterer in the middle of your sister's wedding. Do you have any idea how that looks? People will be talking about this for months. Maybe they'll be talking about how your own daughter was made to serve drinks at her sister's wedding instead of being invited as a guest, Alina said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, years of restrained frustration finally breaking free. Did you ever think about how that looks? Vivian's face flushed with anger. Don't you dare turn this around on me. I gave you an opportunity to be useful, to contribute to this family for once, and you repaid that by making a spectacle of yourself. An opportunity, Alina repeated, disbelief coloring her voice. You didn't give me an opportunity, Mom. You told me I had no choice. You made it clear that my presence here as a guest, as your daughter, wasn't worth as much as my presence as unpaid staff. Claudia appeared at that moment, still in her wedding gown though the veil had been removed, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and simmering anger. Can you two please not do this right now? It's my wedding day. Was your wedding day, Vivian corrected sharply. It's nearly midnight, and your sister has decided tonight was the perfect time to cause a scene. I didn't cause anything, Alina said, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. I existed in a room, and someone treated me with basic human decency for the first time all evening. That's what happened. Claudia crossed her arms, her earlier guilt evidently replaced by defensive irritation. You could have just said no when he offered the seat. You could have avoided the whole situation. Why should I have said no? Alina asked, genuinely bewildered by the accusation. Why is it my job to make myself smaller so everyone else stays comfortable? I've been doing that my entire life, Claudia. I did it tonight, right up until someone finally treated me like I was worth noticing. So this is about you now, Claudia said bitterly. Even my own wedding has to become about you somehow. The unfairness of the accusation struck Alina with such force that for a moment she could not find words at all. She stood there in the emptying hall, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration she had spent all evening serving rather than attending, and felt something inside her finally, completely, give way. I have spent this entire day, this entire evening, making sure everything was about you, Alina said, her voice shaking now, though whether from anger or exhaustion she could not tell. I poured your champagne. I fetched your water. I cleaned up glass so your photos would look perfect. I stood in the background while relatives I've known my whole life looked straight through me like I wasn't even a person. And the one moment, the one single moment tonight, when someone decided I deserved to sit at a table instead of clear it, you're upset because it might have distracted attention away from you for 30 seconds. Claudia's mouth opened, then closed again, something flickering across her face that might have been the beginning of guilt before it hardened back into defensiveness. That's not fair. None of tonight was fair, Alina said, but I'm done pretending that doesn't matter. Vivian stepped between them, her voice sharp with the authority she had used to control every disagreement between her daughters for as long as Alina could remember. That's enough, both of you. Alina, I understand you're tired and clearly overwhelmed by all the attention tonight, but this behavior is unacceptable. You will apologize to your sister for causing a scene at her wedding. Alina looked at her mother, really looked at her, taking in the familiar coldness in her eyes, the practiced disappointment that had shaped so much of Alina's understanding of her own worth over the years, and felt something settle inside her, quiet and certain, that had never quite settled before. No, Alina said simply. Vivian blinked, clearly unprepared for the flat refusal. Excuse me. I said no, Alina repeated, her voice steady now despite the trembling in her hands. I'm not going to apologize for being treated with kindness. I'm not going to apologize for sitting in a chair someone offered me in good faith. I spent this entire night apologizing, Mom, for existing, for taking up space, for not being Claudia. I'm done. The hall had gone completely quiet around them, the last of the catering staff having discreetly retreated to give the family privacy, leaving only the three of them standing amid the wreckage of a celebration that had revealed far more about their family than any of them had likely intended. You ungrateful girl, Vivian said, her voice low and cold in a way that had once made Alina shrink instinctively. Though tonight it landed differently, the old power behind the words somehow diminished. After everything this family has done for you. What have you done for me exactly? Alina asked, and the question was not rhetorical, not born of anger alone, but of genuine, long-buried curiosity finally given voice. Tell me, what has this family actually done for me, besides make me feel like I need to earn a place at the table I was born into? Vivian had no immediate answer, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer, one that settled over all three of them with uncomfortable weight. It was Claudia who finally broke the silence, her voice smaller now, less certain than it had been moments earlier. Alina, I didn't mean for tonight to be like this. I know, Alina said quietly. I don't think you ever mean for it to be like this. But it always is, Claudia. It has been for years, and I'm tired of pretending that isn't true just to keep the peace. She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked toward the staff room to collect her belongings, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor of the now nearly empty hall, leaving her mother and sister standing amid the wilting flowers and cooling candles of a wedding that had revealed, in the end, far more about the family hosting it than about the marriage it was meant to celebrate. Alina did not remember much of the taxi ride home, only the blur of streetlights passing outside the window and the strange, hollow calm that had settled over her after the confrontation in the hall. By the time she reached her small apartment, the adrenaline that had carried her through the final hour of the wedding had drained away completely, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it settled into her bones. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake replaying the evening in fragments, the broken glass, the whispered insults, the steady warmth of Nathaniel's hand helping her to her feet, the devastating clarity of her mother's silence when asked what the family had actually done for her. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake a few hours later to her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. It was Claudia. Alina stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, uncertain whether she had the emotional capacity for another confrontation so soon after the last one. "Hello. Can we talk?" Claudia's voice was quiet, none of the sharp edges from the night before present in her tone. "In person, I mean, not over the phone." Alina hesitated, but something in her sister's voice, a rawness she rarely allowed herself to show, made her agree to meet at a small cafe near her apartment later that afternoon. Claudia arrived looking nothing like the radiant bride from the night before, her hair pulled back simply, dark circles visible beneath her eyes despite the makeup she had clearly applied to disguise them. She sat down across from Alina, wrapping both hands around a cup of coffee she did not drink, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," Claudia finally began, her voice hesitant in a way Alina had rarely heard from her. "About this family never really doing anything for you." "Claudia, you don't have to." "Let me finish," Claudia interrupted, though gently. "I need to say this before I lose the nerve." Alina nodded, waiting. "You know I was always Mom's favorite," Claudia said, staring down at her coffee rather than meeting Alina's eyes. "I never understood why, not really, not until I got older. I always assumed it was because I was the oldest, or because I was better at the things she cared about, grades, appearances, all of it." "Claudia, when I was about 15, Claudia continued, cutting her off again, though her voice had grown quieter still, "I found some old letters in Mom's desk, letters from Dad from before he left. I wasn't supposed to see them, obviously, but I did." Alina felt something tighten in her chest, a familiar unease surfacing at the mention of their father, a man who had left when Alina was only 3 years old and Claudia was 6, a subject their mother had never once discussed openly in the decades since. "What did they say?" Alina asked carefully. Claudia's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "He wanted to take you with him, Alina, not me. He said in the letters that he felt more connected to you, even though you were barely a toddler, and he wanted primary custody, or at least more time with you specifically. Mom fought it, obviously, and she won, but I think something about it broke something in her. I think she spent the rest of our childhood terrified that if she ever let herself favor you the way she favored me, she'd somehow lose you the way she almost lost you to him." Alina sat frozen, the revelation settling over her with a strange, disorienting weight. She had spent her entire life believing she simply was not as lovable as her sister, not as easy to be proud of, not as worthy of her mother's warmth. She had never once considered that the distance might have been rooted in fear rather than genuine disinterest, though the explanation did little to soften the years of accumulated hurt. "That doesn't excuse how she's treated me," Alina said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath the words. "I know," Claudia said quickly. "I'm not trying to excuse it, I think I understood somewhere along the way that being the favorite wasn't really about being better, it was about being safer, and I think without ever really admitting it to myself, I leaned into that. I let myself believe I deserved the warmth more than you did, because it was easier than questioning why Mom was the way she was." Alina studied her sister's face, searching for the familiar defensiveness she had expected, but finding instead something rower, more honest than she had seen from Claudia in years. "Is that why you had me work the wedding?" she asked quietly. "Because some part of you needed to prove you were still the one who mattered more?" Claudia flinched but did not look away. "I think so," she admitted. "I don't think I consciously thought about it that way at the time. I told myself it was just practical, that we needed the help, that you'd understand. But looking back, I think some part of me wanted you smaller that day. I wanted to be the only one anyone was looking at." The honesty of the admission hung between them, painful but strangely clarifying. Years of confusion finally given shape and explanation, even if the explanation did nothing to erase the hurt it had caused. "I'm not going to pretend that makes everything okay," Alina said. "I know," Claudia said. "I'm not asking you to. I just needed you to understand that it was never really about you not being good enough. It was about me being scared, for longer than I probably even realized." They sat in silence for a while after that, the noise of the cafe filling the space between them, neither quite ready to reach for reconciliation, but both, perhaps for the first time, seeing each other clearly instead of through the distorted lens their mother's careful favoritism had created. "What about Mom?" Elena finally asked. "Does she know you told me this?" Claudia shook her head. "No, and honestly I don't know how she'd react if she did. She spent so many years building a version of our family that makes sense to her, one where she's not the reason any of this happened. I don't think she's ready to look at it any other way." "Maybe she never will be," Elena said quietly, the words carrying a resignation that had taken years to fully settle into. "Maybe not," Claudia agreed. "But you don't have to keep waiting for her to change in order to believe you deserve better than what she's given you. Honestly, I think last night proved that. Someone finally saw you the way you should have been seen your whole life, and it terrified all of us, because it meant we'd have to admit how wrong we'd been." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange relief of finally hearing her sister acknowledge something Elena had known, quietly and painfully, for as long as she could remember. "Thank you for telling me," Elena said finally. "I know that wasn't easy." "None of this has been easy," Claudia said, offering a small, tired smile. "But I think it needed to happen, both the wedding disaster and this conversation. Maybe especially this conversation." They talked for a while longer, carefully, tentatively, rebuilding something between them that had been buried for years beneath competition and misunderstanding, though both understood it would take far more than one conversation to fully repair what years of imbalance had damaged. When Claudia finally left, hugging Elena briefly before heading back to Gregory and the beginning of her married life, Elena remained at the small cafe table for a long while, turning the conversation over in her mind, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for as long as she could remember. Her phone buzzed again as she gathered her things to leave, but this time the name on the screen was not one she recognized immediately, a number she had not saved, though the message beneath it made her breath catch in her throat. "I hope you made it home safely last night. I meant what I said at the wedding, Elena. I would very much like to see you again, under circumstances that don't involve broken glass or difficult relatives. Nathaniel." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours settle around her in an entirely new way, no longer just the memory of humiliation and confrontation, but the beginning of something she had not allowed herself to hope for in longer than she could remember. She typed her reply carefully, her fingers hovering over the screen before she finally pressed send, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time all day. "I made it home fine, and I'd like that very much." 3 weeks after the wedding, Elena found herself standing outside a small, unassuming restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, smoothing down the front of a simple blue dress she had chosen for herself, without a single thought toward what anyone else might expect of her. It was such a small thing, choosing an outfit purely because it made her feel good rather than because it needed to meet someone else's approval. And yet it felt like its own quiet victory after years of shaping herself around other people's expectations. Nathaniel was waiting for her at a table near the back, rising from his seat the moment he saw her approach, and Elena felt a warm, steady calm settle over her at the sight of him, so different from the anxious uncertainty that had colored their first meeting. "You look wonderful," he said, pulling out her chair, a small echo of that first gesture at the wedding that had changed everything, though this time there was no audience, no whispered gossip, only the quiet ease of two people who had chosen to be there together. "Thank you," Elena said, settling into the seat. "Though I should warn you, I haven't broken anything yet tonight, so this might be a fairly uneventful dinner by our standards." Nathaniel laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that Elena had come to treasure over the past few weeks of quiet dinners and long conversations, each one peeling back another layer of the careful composure they had both worn like armor when they first met. "I think I can survive an evening without rescuing you from broken glass," he said. though I confess it made for a memorable introduction. Their conversation drifted easily, as it always did now, through small updates on their lives. The job interview Alina had finally secured with a marketing firm that valued her experience rather than dismissing it. The slow, careful repair of her relationship with Claudia, who had begun reaching out more regularly, small gestures of reconnection that Alina was learning to accept without suspicion. Alina had not spoken to her mother since the night of the wedding, and while the silence carried its own quiet grief, she no longer felt the desperate need to fill it with apology or appeasement. "Has your mother reached out at all?" Nathaniel asked gently, sensing the shift in Alina's expression as the topic arose. "Once," Alina admitted. "A voicemail, actually. She didn't apologize exactly, but she asked me to call her back. I haven't decided yet if I'm ready." "There's no timeline you have to follow," Nathaniel said. "Whatever you decide, it should be because it's right for you, not because you feel obligated to fix something that was never entirely yours to fix in the first place." Alina studied him for a moment, struck again by how easily he offered her permission to simply exist as she was, without demands or conditions, a kindness she was still learning to accept without bracing for some hidden cost. "You're remarkably good at saying exactly what I need to hear," she said. "I've had a great deal of practice listening to what people actually mean, rather than what they think they're supposed to say," Nathaniel replied. "It comes with the territory of a title people either fear or try to flatter. You learn quickly to appreciate honesty when you finally encounter it." "Is that what I am to you?" Alina asked, a teasing note in her voice, though the question carried real curiosity beneath it. "An exercise in appreciating honesty." Nathaniel reached across the table, his hand finding hers with the same steady confidence he had shown from their very first meeting. "You're considerably more than that," he said, his tone losing its earlier lightness, replaced by something more sincere. "You're the first person in longer than I can remember who has never once asked me for anything, who never adjusted her behavior the moment she learned my title, who simply treated me as a person worth knowing rather than a prize worth securing. I find that I'm rather fond of the way that feels." Alina felt warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar but welcome, the sensation of being valued not for what she could offer or how well she could disappear into the background, but simply for who she was. "I'm fond of it too," she admitted quietly. They lingered over dinner long after their plates had been cleared, the restaurant slowly emptying around them as the evening deepened, neither in any hurry to end the conversation that had come so naturally between them since that first strange, humiliating, transformative night at Claudia's wedding. It was as they stepped outside into the cool evening air, walking slowly along the quiet street toward where Nathaniel's car waited, that Alina finally allowed herself to voice the thought that had been building in her mind for days. "I keep thinking about that night," she said, "and how close I came to just accepting it. The apron, the invisibility, all of it. If you hadn't said something, if you hadn't pulled out that chair, I think I would have just gone home that night, cried a little, and gone right back to accepting whatever scraps of attention my family decided to give me. I think I'd been doing that my whole life without even realizing how deeply it had settled into who I was." Nathaniel stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the soft glow of a street lamp. "I don't think that's true," he said gently. "I think you would have found your own way to that moment eventually, with or without me. I simply happened to be there when it finally became too heavy to carry quietly any longer. You did the hard part yourself, Alina. Standing up to your mother, confronting your sister, choosing to sit in that chair despite every instinct telling you that you didn't deserve to. That courage was entirely yours." "I don't know if I believe that," Alina said softly. "Then believe it because I do," Nathaniel said, "until you're ready to believe it for yourself." Alina felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen so completely, so gently, by someone who asked nothing of her in return except the simple truth of who she already was. She stepped closer, and Nathaniel reached up to brush away a single tear that had escaped down her cheek, his touch careful, deliberate, filled with a tenderness that felt entirely new and yet somehow already familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, "for pulling out that chair." "Thank you for sitting in it," he replied, and the smile that followed held none of the careful composure he had worn like armor the night they first met, only warmth, only genuine affection for the woman standing before him, finally, fully seen. Above them, the streetlights flickered softly against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of the city carried on unaware of the quiet, transformative moment unfolding on a small street corner, where a woman once made invisible by her own family had finally, unmistakably, found a place where she belonged. 6 months later, Alina stood in the sunlit kitchen of a small house she had recently begun renting on her own, the marketing job she had secured now grown into a role she genuinely enjoyed, one that recognized her ideas rather than overlooking them. She had learned, slowly and deliberately, what it meant to build a life shaped by her own choices, rather than the quiet expectations of a family that had spent years teaching her to take up as little space as possible. Her relationship with Claudia had continued to mend in careful, honest increments, neither sister rushing the process nor pretending the old wounds had vanished entirely. They met for coffee most weeks now, conversations that no longer carried the sharp undertones of competition, replaced instead by a fragile but genuine closeness neither of them had experienced since childhood. Claudia had, in her own way, begun standing up to their mother more often, small moments of quiet defense on Alina's behalf that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Vivian remained a more complicated presence in Alina's life. They spoke occasionally now, brief, careful conversations that neither pretended were fully healed, though something had shifted since the letters Claudia had revealed. Alina had eventually called her mother back, not to forgive everything in a single conversation, but to begin the slow, uncertain work of understanding, without excusing, the fear that had shaped so much of her childhood. It was not the relationship Alina had once hoped for, but it was honest, and for the first time, that honesty felt like enough. Oliver, the young caterer whose quiet kindness had steadied her through the worst hours of the wedding, had become an unexpected friend, someone Alina met for lunch occasionally, grateful for the reminder that genuine decency could appear in the most unexpected corners of a difficult night. And Nathaniel remained a steady, grounding presence in her life, their relationship deepening slowly, deliberately, built not on grand gestures, but on the accumulated weight of small, consistent kindnesses, late-night conversations, quiet support during difficult days, the simple, extraordinary experience of being known and valued exactly as she was. On a warm evening in early autumn, Nathaniel took Alina's hand as they walked along the same quiet street where he had once wiped a tear from her cheek, and told her, with the same steady sincerity that had first caught her attention across a crowded ballroom, that he could not imagine building his future with anyone else. Alina, standing beneath a sky painted gold with the last light of the setting sun, no longer the invisible daughter forced into a uniform at her sister's wedding, but a woman who had learned, at great cost and greater courage, exactly what she was worth, said yes. The story of the caterer and the Duke became, in time, a favorite among their friends and family, told and retold at gatherings for years to come, though Alina always insisted on including every detail, the broken glass, the humiliation, the long walk home in the dark, because she understood something that had taken her far too long to learn. The most important part of her story was never the chair a Duke had pulled out for her in a crowded hall. It was the quiet, difficult decision she had made, in the days and weeks that followed, to finally sit down at the table of her own life, and stay.